press conference ahead of a vital moment at the UN for both the biodiversity and climate crisis, which are really two sides of the same crisis. With CBD, conventional biological diversity meetings underway in Geneva, Switzerland, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change due to release another report on confirming again the state of climate crisis and urging more action, but unfortunately also expected to provide some very problematic proposals for solutions. So at this vital moment, we're happy to welcome you to this press conference where we will share with you a statement 12 organizations issued last year calling on fellow organizations in the social and environmental and climate justice movements to join us in a call to say very loud and clear no to nature-based solutions. And you will hear from the different speakers why we are so concerned about this proposal of the nice-sounding nature-based solutions, which we believe or fear will turn into nature-based dispossessions. And are a very deceitful proposal that will accelerate climate change, cause a massive land grab, and bring detrimental impacts for the peoples and forest-dependent communities that have depended on forests and guarded forests for centuries and decades and generations. I am joined on the panel today by Marty Townsend, Brent Newell, Ninawa Hunikuin, and Tom Goldtooth. Marty is with the National Family Farm Coalition. She's an organic pastured beef farmer from Ohio, and we'll talk about the National Family Farm Coalition's experience with programs and concerns with programs around soil carbon measurements and the coalitions due to these deceitful nature-based solutions. And Brent is a lawyer with many years of experience in both litigation and advice on legislation. We're very honored to have him, very pleased to have him here to share his experience on advising communities who are calling for real emission reductions and not market-based trading programs. Joined on the panel also Ninawa Hunikuin, leader of the Hunikuin in Acre, Brazil, and a critic of the government's programs on green economy. Acre in Brazil, a laboratory for green economy proposals, and Ninawa will be sharing with us his people's experience with those green economy programs. And with RED, the precursor, the reduced emissions on deforestation and forest degradation programs in Acre in particular. And Tom Goldtooth, long-term Indigenous activist from North America. Tom has decades of experience in championing Indigenous people's rights causes, and amazing activist and organizer who will be sharing his experience from pushing back against nature-based solutions and similar false solutions in the UN policy spaces. Without further eating into the time of those panelists, I would like to pass the word to Mandy. We'll try to keep it at 10 minutes each for the interventions, a little less if possible. And we would ask journalists or anybody with questions to the panelists to put them in the chat. We'll make sure there is time at the end. And because we cannot see from your registrations always whether you're a member of the press or interested activist, we will give priority to press questions. So please identify yourself as press if you put the question in the chat. With that, over to you, Marty. Yeah, the floor.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate being here. This is a fascinating group of people. Before I start, I want to make sure that people understand that my comments are applicable to the US Midwest, because that's where I'm from, and that is the agriculture that I know. So I have been raising grass-fed beef on this farm for almost 30 years now, and I've been measuring the soil organic matter. And the farm was very degraded when we started grazing here. There had been a lot of loss of topsoil, and the soil carbon is inching up, but it's inching up differently in different fields. And so this is really the focus of what I want to say, is that we can sequester carbon by our agricultural practices, but how we do it is going to depend on every field, on every field's history, on the soil type, on the rainfall patterns, on the cropping patterns, and whether or not animals are actually integrated into the system. And what I see happening with the US and the US Department of Agriculture proposals are very simple things to sequester carbon that are easy to prescribe, but they do not take into account the fact that the more complicated the system is, the better it's going to be environmentally, the more carbon it's going to sequester, and the more the side effects from good agricultural practices are going to affect the environment. And so I live in the Lake Erie watershed, and we have a huge problem with phosphorus in Lake Erie causing algae blooms. And so what we need to be doing is more permanent ground cover to prevent erosion from nutrients going into the lake. And I fear that the USDA will be using its power to incentivize certain agricultural practices to do things that are very simple for them to quantify and measure, but will not encourage the kind of diversified farming that has so many benefits, both to the land and to the people that farm it. And that's all I really have to say, except that you can measure carbon, and it may be there today, and it may be in a different form tomorrow, and it doesn't stay put. And that is what the speculators are counting on, that you can get carbon into the soil, you can measure it, you can say there it is, and you can trade it on the world commodity markets. And as far as I can tell, the people that are most interested in the carbon sequestration in this country are the people who are going to make money by speculating on it, and they don't really have anything to do with the farming themselves.
Thank you, Marty, for this excellent insight into the reality of carbon farming and the risks of and to climate, the jeopardy of attempting to trade carbon. We had an earlier press conference this morning at the Asia and Europe convenient hours, and we had a colleague from India to talk about a soil carbon trading program there called Bhumitra. I'll put that in the chat in a moment. And his words of caution were very much echoing yours, that it's carbon can be measurable in the soil today and gone tomorrow, and there are endless possibilities of rigging the measuring of carbon in soil as well, something we know very well also from carbon offset programs that involve tree planting and forest protection. One aspect that Sumitra Dutta this morning shared with us, Sumya, sorry, another risk that was arising from the carbon farming scheme in India was a massive concentration of control of the information about soil fertility and the makeup of the soil by large corporate agro-industries who were sponsoring the Bumitra carbon farming scheme. So not only a risk to the climate, a risk to farming, but also a risk to decision-making and control over the data that is so vital to the knowledge or to the makeup of your soil. I pass to Brent, not without saying that the statement that I mentioned at the beginning that we launched last year has been signed by more than 360 organizations from across the globe who have joined us in saying very loud and clear no to nature-based solutions, because they're not solutions, they're a scheme to dispossess. With that, I pass to Brent, who has worked with communities in California and beyond, who are calling for direct emission cuts and not bogus carbon trading schemes. Brent, the word is yours, or the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a privilege to be here with you all today. What I'd like to discuss is how the U.S. Department of Agriculture has recently adopted the voluntary so-called climate smart agriculture program in response to the global climate crisis and the need to achieve rapid, sustained, and significant methane reductions as called for by the IPCC and what the UN General Secretary called a climate code red. This program, as described by the USDA, will help lay the foundation to establish a pollution trading scheme for offsets derived from nature-based solutions and from methane reductions from fuels that are derived from the factory farm system and how it liquefies manure and thus emits methane. This program is supposed to and marketed as something that will help agricultural goods be marketed to consumers as climate smart agriculture. But stepping back for a moment, market-based pollution trading schemes for stationary sources and for transportation fuels, especially in California, where I have done a lot of work with environmental justice communities. These have caused and continue to cause racially disparate impacts in California. The environmental justice movement has for years called for direct emissions reductions instead of pollution trading, and has pointed out that communities of color will bear the burden of those pollution trading schemes while polluters benefit. That's because polluters buy offsets and continue their pollution or even increase their pollution. And we're not just talking about greenhouse gas emissions from large refineries or cement plants or factories and power plants. And we're not just talking about greenhouse gas emissions from cars and trucks burning fossil fuels. We're talking about the co-pollutants that are emitted at the same time. I'm talking about toxic air pollution, fine particulate matter, and all the literature, all the data show that those emissions are causing a racially disparate impact on communities of color that are more likely to be those that are near those large pollution sources and are more likely to be living along heavy transportation corridors. But to date, the US government has only proposed voluntary and publicly subsidized methane reductions from agricultural sources. And this is despite having the legal authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate those agricultural sources that contribute a massive amount of that methane. I'm talking about industrial, dairy, and hog operations. These operations confine thousands of animals and liquefy their manure, thus causing significant and unabated methane emissions from these football field size impoundments of liquid manure. A petition filed by Public Justice on behalf of 25 environmental justice and environmental groups to regulate this sector has gone unanswered. And this petition details the current legal authority that the US government has to impose direct emissions reductions on this sector. This petition was filed almost a year ago and has gone unanswered. Instead, the US Department of Agriculture is proposing to pay large farmers and factory farms millions of dollars to subsidize both nature-based solutions and polluting manure management practices to produce what we call factory farm gas. Now, this is dirty energy. It's a false climate solution and is labeled by industry as so-called renewable fuel. But this fuel production does nothing to abate the devastating water and air pollution on local rural communities, communities of color from the factory farm system. It is far from climate smart agriculture. In fact, there's nothing smart about failing to adopt mandatory methane reductions during our climate crisis. The US Department of Agriculture wants to lay a foundation to sell offsets from renewable fuels, so-called renewable fuels, and lay the foundation for an offset scheme so that corporations can claim they've achieved net zero emissions in voluntary pollution trading schemes, or that those offsets can be sold into publicly run and fundamentally broken schemes like California's cap and trade program. It's not mom and pop farmers or small farmers that are going to benefit from this. It's going to be the big polluters. So with that, I'll conclude and look forward to any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brent, for this insight into what carbon trading schemes have meant and will mean even more for communities of color in California area, and for communities, I will add, who will suffer the massive land grab that will become a reality as more and more corporations adopt so-called net zero carbon pledges, but the net is not achieved by real emission reductions, but by buying carbon offsets, as Brent mentioned, from offset projects that elsewhere occupy land and amount, in essence, to a double land grab, giving even more corporate control over land and not addressing the climate crisis either. To give you an idea of the scale of the land grab that is ahead if nature-based solutions are not stopped in their track. The Italian oil company Eni is one of the many corporate players that has adopted a so-called net zero carbon and carbon neutrality policy by 2050. Eni, the oil company or energy company, wants to call itself carbon neutral, but it is still planning to produce 90% of its energy by 2050 based on fossil gas. So the carbon neutrality that Eni hopes to achieve and is marketing will come from buying massive amounts, 40 million carbon credits a year by 2050. And that will mean massive control over land elsewhere, because that much carbon will not be available easily on the lands of Italy. It amounts to roughly the full capacity of trees and forests growing today in Italy to that Eni would require or demand in carbon offsets for its 90% fossil fueled energy by 2050. Clearly, that's a road to climate disaster, and clearly that's a road to corporate land grabs that we must prevent. I pass to Chief Ninawa Hunikuin, from the Hunikuin in Acre in Brazil, a laboratory of the green economy, and indigenous peoples in particular in Acre have felt what it means to live in a laboratory of the green economy and face the brunt of carbon trading schemes such as the RED programs. Ninawa, the floor is yours. And Ninawa will be speaking in Portuguese, so those of you who need it, at the bottom of your screen, please choose the English interpretation if you need it. Ninawa, the floor is yours.
Muito bom dia aqui.
Good morning. It's the early afternoon actually here in Brazil. I want to say a very special thank you for the invitation to Utah. Also very nice to see brothers and sisters like Tamara, Tom, everyone here present on my screen. I just want to briefly tell you about our experience here in the state of Acre. I'm a leader of the Honequin people. I have this representation role of my people through our organization, which is called FEPAC. And we have worked hard to try to show the reality to the world of what it means that these offset programs, the red programs meant here in Acre, and what they are still, the impacts that are still being happening to our families. The first example that caused in the state of Acre a red program was a division of our leadership, our leaders, brothers, cousins, who became enemies, political enemies, because of this program. After that, also, the threats to the leaders that were against these programs, the government mapped the leaders that were against and took away all their participation and potential benefits. Also, the experience that we have here is of the domination by the government over the indigenous territories. This domination in order to have carbon credit trading, because we have preserved areas that produce this carbon, so the government has taken over this territory, brought a neo-colonial model to these indigenous territories. And another experience that we have here with RED programs is the criminalization of the territories. There are surveys about or conducted by research bodies of the government that say that communities are the main deforesters, the main cause of the problems, and they don't include the agribusiness, the loggers, the invaders, and criminalizes the traditional communities and the indigenous peoples instead. In other words, as a rule, we have no good experiences because the millions and billions that are destined to the government, destined by the government to programs do not reach our communities. There's no improvement in education. The schools in our areas are worse than ever. There's no decent health care for our people. There is no access to communities. There's no protection of the territories. There has been a complete stoppage of land demarcation. So we're going back. There's a logging program that is taking away all the best wood from our state. It's all the opposite of what is preached. So it's not a good example. So we denounce all these attempts. I think that's enough from me. I want to put myself at your disposal to answer your questions. We are here to be able to answer to the best of our abilities. But this is a reality. I'm not inventing, I'm not making up a story. If you come to Acre and see the communities of indigenous communities, it's there for everyone to see. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ninawa, for this insight into the reality of the green economy in Acre for indigenous peoples and for forest-dependent communities as well. The state where deforestation has gone up as RED has been implemented. It's a striking coincidence between those two factors. More RED has meant more deforestation, not less, in the state of Acre. And as Chief Ninawa pointed out, it has also meant an abandoning of the deforestation of the demarcation of indigenous peoples' territories that peoples have been calling for and are waiting for legal recognition of their territories for decades. And as RED has been rolled out across much of Brazil, demarcation programs have been shelved in many states. And that means the risk to deforestation on indigenous territories is larger than ever. And we see that in the resulting explosion of deforestation across the Amazon, particularly the Brazilian Amazon. With that, I pass the word to Tom Goldtooth, who has been accompanying the launching and the promoting of fall solutions in many UN spaces. Tom, tell us about the pushback that you and other indigenous activists have been bringing to those spaces.
Yes, thank you, Utah. And it's good to see everyone on this panel presentation. It's a very important topic that we need to talk to the press about. Yes, I and our delegation within the Indigenous Peoples organizations, our Indigenous Environmental Network, and many others, not just from the North, but from the Global South as well. We've been very concerned about the escalation of the climate crisis. And, you know, as we know from different things we read, is that this past year and going into this year is acceleration of the climate impacts. And here in where I live in the state of Minnesota, in the United States, we're just south of the Canadian border, you know, accessing and harvesting the natural wild rice, you know, was really difficult this past season. The water table's gone down, and some people couldn't access the traditional spiritual medicine, the food to eat. And then, as we know, science is saying that you know, we have to drastically cut emissions at their source in order to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. You know, we see that Indigenous peoples that participate in the UN climate negotiations, we bring that story, we bring that message. I've been participating in those UN forums since 1998, and we're very concerned about this. And as we know, that right now what we're seeing is an expansion of fossil fuels. That's our reality in the North and South, where all the governments are pushing climate solutions. We see a report that came out in 2020, 2 years ago, Banking on Climate Change, that said 36 global banks have expanded the fossil fuel sector with investments more than $2.7 trillion. That's 4 years since the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. So we see constant contradictions and greenwashing in these decisions, not only at the global level, but at the national level as well. So part of the trend that we're concerned about that talks about nature-based solutions is coming under this term net zero emissions frame that brings into different discussions is terminology like nature-based solutions, nature climate solutions, natural capital. You know, that's forests and soils, like what was talked about, agriculture, land, our waters, our coastal ecosystems, and terms like regenerative agriculture that was talked about, carbon farming, and including embedding the reduction of emissions from deforestation and degradation called RED. in a lot of different mechanisms, conservation, biodiversity offsets, like the 30 times 30 initiative global, but also that's being initiated here in the United States, where our network is based. And then the link, bringing in the whole arena of geoengineering technologies. That's a whole nother discussion, carbon capture and storage. But in our indigenous analysis of nature-based solutions, one of the things that is very fundamental is it's part of the financialization of nature process that separates and quantifies that sacredness and that function and the cycles of our Mother Earth, and turning them into like part of climate capitalism, like units that can be sold in the financial and speculative markets. With our consultation with indigenous spiritual leaders, people who are knowledgeable of cultural traditional knowledge, they have said that's you know, that's not right. That's a creation of this these ways that are actually destroying that sacredness of Mother Earth. And so we see NBC as an umbrella that covers a range of these schemes for climate conservation and biodiversity protection. It's dangerous, it's damaging. It's you know, it's part of a concept that is based on carbon markets, offsets, payment for ecological services, and our indigenous peoples and our network and our global coalition are demanding an end to this as a solution. It provides no certainty, and that nature and ecosystems will be, you know, protected. No, it's a greenwash that's used by the polluters, the corporations and governments, and also the financiers, the banks, to continue business as usual. So as you know, as Indigenous Peoples delegation at the recent COP27, we were really looking at a growth of resistance from NGOs and people organizations, community organizations in Glasgow, Scotland, that supported our analysis. And some of those folks are speaking here on the panel. And there was a strong resistance from civil society against nature-based solutions and these concepts of net zero solutions. But you know, is that strong enough to change the political climate inside the UN that we've seen since the early 90s has involved a corporate takeover? And no, it wasn't enough, but there's still a hope in our resistance, is that you know, our message as Indigenous people, you know, has to be heard, our spiritual message, to remind the negotiators of these United Nations meetings that they have to remember their spiritual commitment to the sacredness of our Mother Earth and Father Sky. That was a strong message we had, and it did resonate with some of the staffers, with the delegation from the governments. And we have to continue to work with the press to give them that voice that sometimes is drowned out. And so, you know, we got to continue to resist this sugarcoating with offset schemes, again, like net zero carbon and no net loss of biodiversity. Those are language that they're tags that we have to look for, that is trying to water down real solutions. So if we don't cut emissions at source, you know, we're really concerned. That's what we're looking at. Any solutions to look at, does it cut emissions at source? And right now in the United States, what we're seeing right now is not cutting emissions at source. The carbon pricing, the carbon market system, and the geoengineering technologies. Thank you. We only have one Mother Earth, and we have to do everything we can to protect her.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you all the panelists for this snapshot into the false solutions that are being peddled at the UN climate spaces and in corporate fora and corporate marketing. They seem to accelerate as the climate crisis accelerates. Tom mentioned the large creativity that corporate polluters and governments resort to hide that there is no interest and not enough pressure to reduce emissions drastically at source. RED, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, the scheme that has delayed action for the last 15 years. Now we see the large volume of corporate net zero pledges that have nothing to do with really reducing greenhouse gas emissions and moving quickly to an end of fossil fuel burning, but very much the opposite, to justify the continuation of corporate profiting from the fossil fuel economy. And nature-based solutions, a nice sound that rings very falsely in the ears and very deceptively in the ears. I now would open the chat for questions, if you have any, and as I said, we will be prioritizing press. So if you're a member of the press and would like pose a question to any of the panelists, please type it in the chat, and we will read it out, and you will hear from the respective panelists. While we wait for people to type away on the chat, I will say to the Spanish speakers, sorry, yes, we are aware that you got the short end of the straw today because we were too rushed to get organized with Spanish translation. An oversight we will make sure we work on for next time. I see no questions in the chat yet. Everything's so clear that there is no additional questions open. Anybody? Perhaps yes, there's a question. Let's go. Lucia, there I need to help. I overlooked. Oh, where did I see the question in Spanish that I didn't see? You posted in Spanish, I can read it out. I just didn't see it in the chat. How do we how those of you who've joined to find out more about the process and the joint activities, as I said at the beginning, there was 12 organizations who came together last year to get the ball rolling on this statement, No to Nature-Based Solutions, which has been signed by 364 organizations. It's at the end, one of the motivations for doing that was to create a place of coordination amongst civil society organizations. And perhaps if you would like to stay in touch and be informed about the action and activities we will be planning as time moves on, please put your contacts in the chat, and we will make sure we pass on the information of activities. And we encourage all the signatories of the statement. You know, it's your statement, it's everybody's statement. We need to work with all ways we have to strengthen the voice that says no to nature-based solutions, because those nature-based solutions will mean a massive land grab and more and not less climate change and climate chaos. Any There are no more questions. There is one from Tom Smith, freelance journalist. What are the positions of the different parties to the COP with respect to nature-based solutions? Are there some countries that are more skeptical or critical than others? Tom, do you want to say something about the politics at the climate conferences and the Convention on Biological Diversity?
Yes, it's a good question. It's been very difficult to assess this focus of that kind of a question. And there's been different attempts by different non-governmental organizations throughout the years who have analyzed this, who are the champions around looking at the impacts around what we have called false solutions to mitigating climate change. It's been interesting that it has generally been the industrialized northern countries that have been, very firm on what we're talking about these false solutions, carbon markets, carbon trading mechanisms. Even in Europe, with the failure of the emissions trading regime, Europe is still pushing. And so there's been always a close link between the banks, the investments, and the role of the World Bank and large NGOs, conservation and environmental NGOs who have an investment in these market systems. I think that, it's been a result of the tremendous organizing work of many different grassroots groups and civil society NGOs calling out these false solutions that we're talking about here. And even on REDD, the REDD, there was a little symbol of red sticker with the red line through it. That movement of resistance against REDD, no REDD, really grew globally to a point to where those of us trying to go into the UN security gate, if there was that sticker on our ID on the backside, they ask us to take it off. Even we saw that in Paris Agreement in 2015, where this mobilization of what you're hearing right now was not using the word red. But there's other terminologies that were used, and we saw now nature presenting itself, big banners of nature, photographs and paintings of nature, to look as if industry and the government finally recognizing nature as a solution to climate change. So, and it basically has a lot of funding to it. It's a $1 trillion industry. How do we fight that? And who are our champions? It's ironic, some of the champions that have said, hey, we got to listen to you and we got to support you. Bolivia has been consistent in that. Just this past COP, they attended some of our side events, denouncing nature-based solutions, denouncing net zero emissions and they had their delegation, but their indigenous delegation as a government was there with them, and they understood. The small island states are really saying on the side in the hallways, we support you because we got the most to suffer as well with the rising tide. But it gets very political too. They depend on money from northern countries. So it's very political. I can't say there's any champions with the northern industrialized countries, even, you know, the junior governments like Canada, they're invested with the expansion of fossil fuels with the tar sands. So the link with the campaign to keep fossil fuels in the ground is a big concern. Even our networking with the non-fossil fuel proliferation treaty group, I'm a member of that, and we're trying to strategize on that. Who are those governments that we need to work with towards fighting for real solutions on moving away from a fossil fuel economy? Thank you.
Thank you. I have two more questions that go in a similar line that focus on the hard choices that some Indigenous peoples have had to make, who've seen their land degraded and in need of funding to restore the land. And example mentioned by Sam Butler here of the Yurok in Canada, or the Yurok and communities in Canada who have looked to carbon credits as a way to move away from logging on traditional territories, Indigenous territories. Are there any alternatives, Sam Butler asks, that groups are working with, and reflections on those situations and examples like resorting to carbon credits as a way to move away from activities like logging and the like. And linked to that question from Yvonne Yanes, what to make and how to interpret that some organizations, including across the Amazon, are promoting nature-based solutions as part of their rights recognition. And where is the connection between nature-based solutions and plans to hugely expand the area of conservation or land under conservation? Anybody who would like to take that, please take the floor.
Maybe Ninawa, Chief Ninawa might be good to respond.
Ninawa, you want to take this question about the situation of Indigenous peoples and communities, organizations across the Amazon who have come out in support of nature-based solutions as one way to recognize rights. Let me add one reflection on this discussion also, in that, like RED already, the precursor of nature-based solutions, nature-based solutions is an even wider, vaguer, and undefined term that is deceptive and dangerous also for the reason that it allows very different interests to come away with a very different interpretation of what is behind nature-based solutions. And we have seen that in the 15 years of RED programs, reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradations, where the World Bank was one of the institutions heavily pushing RED and carbon markets, but also providing millions to Indigenous communities and associations for a Indigenous version of RED, only to, after years, see that none of the requests and demands of Indigenous organizations who had joined RED, Indigenous RED in good faith, were being taken seriously. One in particular, the Indigenous people's request for land demarcation, was never taken up meaningfully. And we see a repeat of those tendencies and abuses, in a way, with nature-based solutions today. Such a nice sounding term that is very deceptive, because it allows for everybody to come away with the interpretation they want, and those with the money and the interest to use nature-based solutions as a way to expand the fossil fuel economy and the profiting from it, to have very different ideas about what nature-based solutions will mean than communities who, out of a lack of other options, may revert to it as a way to fight for their rights. Nina, what? The floor is yours. You want to add? Comment?
Talvez fazer uma
Perhaps just to complement what Tom and Yuta said, we have examples of these creations, of these legal frameworks. In 2010, when there was the start of the legalization of this neo-colonialism via offsets, nature-based solutions, there was a bill in the State House, which was the Law 2308 of 2010. The first action was to use bad faith to create a bill that did not have the participation in its formulation of the traditional and indigenous communities. I believe the main intention was precisely about finance, and then there was after the CISA law with 11 items. The focus within the CISA law was the RED program because of the financial revenue raising potential, let's say. A few years ago, there was also an association created, a task force of the Amazon region, the 9 state governments discussing about the future agreements, financial agreements, as a solution to save the Amazon region. But this task force of the governors, of the state governors, does not have the participation of any traditional or indigenous communities participating at all. And the idea is to justify, this absence, they created an institution, a governmental institution, which is a sort of a department that discusses climate issues, and a council with the participation of 2 or 3 people that are friends or service providers. I don't know if they still participate, but they used to. 2 or 3 indigenous people that they were so-called representatives of the indigenous peoples that did not. So it's not their decision, it's not their intention to have an indigenous voice in these councils. And also, at the COP that took place in Peru, there was the creation, within our organization at the Amazon level, which is COICA, there was the creation of the indigenous RED, called REN. And the intention was that no segment of the indigenous population has to stay outside of the discussion. So the discussion was parceled out between different indigenous peoples. So you talk to leaders, and then if young people complain or women complain, they create a separate working group to discuss with just the youngsters or just the women. But These are discussions that don't have any sustainability because they don't lead to any results, any concrete results from these discussions. Everybody knows that there's a long-running trajectory about these so-called nature-based solutions. In fact, nature doesn't need governments or corporations or banks to discuss its own restructuring, because nature by itself can reconstruct itself. But the intention of these corporations, of these governments, is not to solve the problem, the climate problem of the world. It's just geared towards the financial aspects. We know that nature does not depend on us humans. We are the ones that depend on it, but we're not knowing how to look after it properly. People sometimes ask me, what is the true solution? I always say that for the Amazon region, it's the demarcation of indigenous lands to give the territories back to the peoples. That's a solution. That's a real solution. But governments, banks have no interest because it will not generate revenues for the corporations with the demarcation of indigenous lands. To take out timber, yes. To take out ores, yes. To take out oil and gas, yes. Those generate revenues. But land demarcation, no. The false solutions are very clear to our eyes. It's suffices for us to understand the logic. The company that is paying for the offset is the same company that is destroying. It's simple as that. So regarding that, there is no nature-based solutions discussed by governments or corporations. What there are solutions that are nature-based when you respect indigenous knowledge, when you respect nature on its own accord. Those are nature-based solutions, not the ones that the government, the banks, and also these foundations that are created by governments to discuss carbon credits and trading. So the manipulation is constant.
Thank you, Ninoa, and for the context of what nature-based solutions mean and how they never mean demarcation and undertaking the actions that we have known for decades what to do. And when I say we, it's social movements, but also governments. It's not for lack of knowledge that no action has been taken to halt deforestation. When you look across the Brazilian Amazon, it's for me always the most striking of examples that where indigenous people's territories have been demarcated, deforestation is by far lower than it is outside the areas that await demarcation still, and where deforestation, that await demarcation and where deforestation is rampant. I would like to close with one final question to speakers. Tom, Brent, please feel free to take the floor there. A question from Larry Lomond. This is one of the things that we notice is that with initiatives like challenges with nature, or one of the challenges, terms like nature-based solutions, RED 30 by 30 conservation initiative, is that they're also backed partly originated even by environmental organizations, or by organizations who themselves call themselves environmental NGOs and who cooperate with large business, big business and right-wing governments, such as that of the US. That often confuses journalists and observers who wonder why our panelists, we today, who are also seen as environmentalists, are opposed to what other environmentalists are saying. So what's your experience, Tom, Brent, Ninawa with this problem of there being a group of environmental organizations describing themselves as environmental, promoting the very ideas that we are finding very dangerous and deceitful.
Well, a lot of these large NGOs have no mechanism of being accountable to civil society. They have no mechanism of being accountable to vulnerable communities, and no mechanism at all on being accountable to indigenous peoples. When we in our network in the North challenge the US government and the large non-government organizations here in the belly of the beast of capitalism, we charge them with environmental racism. So with that is definitely old mentalities of the pioneers of who came and settled the United States. With that was issues of racism, colonialism. So what this question brings up is, how do we confront colonialism? How do we fight for a new economy that doesn't abuse what indigenous peoples talk about the sacred relationship that humans must have with Mother Earth and Father Sky? These large NGOs have no concept of what that is. They will fight that. They literally fight us, whether it's on a panel, a debate. They will challenge me as the speakers, and they will get mad and say, well, what's your solution, Tom Goldtooth? You know, as if indigenous peoples are not being what you say realistic. They will even say indigenous peoples are not realistic. So definitely, I think that how do we get this message out there? Within our network, last year, we worked with some allies like Oil Change International. We produced a report called the Indigenous Resistance Against Carbon. Indigenous Resistance Against Carbon. It's on the IEN website, Indigenous Environmental Network website. It demonstrated the tangible impact that indigenous campaigns of resistance fighting fossil fuel extraction across Canada and the United States, and that this resistance stopped or delayed greenhouse gas pollution equivalent to at least 1/4 of the annual US and Canadian emissions. So our resistance to fossil fuels production and combustion is a solution. So we will continue to fight for that. And we do have solutions as well. Indigenous knowledge on our agriculture systems, for an example, and sharing that with other communities here and in the global South. So, you know, it is a good question of how do we confront and hold those corporations accountable, those environmental organizations. And our part of our strategy is that we need to get information to the grassroots. In the Amazon, as we started to go into Ecuador and Amazon, Peru, and we develop popular education in Spanish, and to get information to the ground in the Amazon, to the communities about these nature-based solutions like RED, for an example, and give them information. A lot of them were told by these NGOs that the money coming to them, they weren't clear on where the money is coming from. I remember I used to, you know, ask those communities when I meet them at a meeting in Quito or someplace, where did they say the money comes from? And they kind of caught them because they thought it was coming from the World Bank or some, you know, financial institution. I said, that's coming from Chevron. That RED project, money's coming from Chevron. And they get confused and they got hurt from being lied to. one of the things, final comments I want to make is that in these carbon trading mechanisms, to enter that sacredness of these units of carbon, of air, into a capitalist market system, it involves a process of determining whose property right carbon is, a property right of ownership. And it's corporations like Chevron, the polluters, who have gained ownership of the carbon in the trees. So now that leads to land grabs. And so that's why, as Indigenous people, we're part of this resistance and asking civil society to join us. That is part of the whole capitalization of climate and financialization of nature, corporations owning Mother Earth. That's where it's coming to. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Brent?
I'd like to underscore some of the points that Tom Goldtooth just made very powerfully. In California, cap and trade has been the policy of the state since the adoption, or shortly after the adoption of Assembly Bill 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act. And there are two concrete examples I'd like to share about how problematic certain large environmental NGOs have in this space. Shortly after cap and trade was adopted by the California Air Resources Board, environmental justice leaders on the statutorily created Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, they participated in the scoping plan adoption, and then after CARB ignored their input and adopted cap and trade anyway, those organizations filed a lawsuit, and the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, where I was an attorney at the time, represented them against the Air Resources Board. And in that lawsuit, the Environmental Defense Fund intervened on the side of the Air Resources Board in the litigation and litigated against the environmental justice leaders and community-based organizations. In another instance, in 2017, when Governor Jerry Brown was lobbying and pushing to extend cap and trade from its sunset date in 2020 to a new sunset date 2030 to extend that program, he was having a very difficult time politically to do that. And the environmental justice movement was mounting a major resistance to the extension of this pollution trading scheme. Governor Brown ended up cutting a deal with oil companies and Republicans in order to pass the legislation in the Democrat-controlled California legislature. And some of these same big environmental NGOs supported the governor in that move. So, this is a real problem, and it's also dangerous when the same NGOs not only take the side of what oil companies want to do from a policy perspective, but it's also problematic when those same NGOs adopt the language of racial justice and try to parrot that language and compete with environmental justice organizations for resources. Environmental justice organizations are traditionally significantly under-resourced compared to large environmental NGOs. So this is a very significant problem. I'm not sure what the answer is. However, it's important for those in this movement to ensure that we do not commodify, as Tom Goldtooth said, Mother Earth, that we hold these other organizations accountable and ensure that they support communities and do not either intentionally or unintentionally support policies that inflict racial discrimination on people. That's unacceptable.
And some striking examples there that both you and Tom have shared. Thank you very much. Striking examples for what I would call straight dishonesty, and which I have come across in the last 15 years of meeting with communities who are affected by RED projects, the precursor of nature-based solutions initiatives, RED, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. A striking dishonesty often by those who've been pushing RED and presenting RED to community organizations. Like Tom said, being not honest about where the money comes from that arise in communities, if it arises. Usually it's mostly promises about money, and then the money takes a long time coming if it ever does. But what will stay in the community is a conflict, because all of those projects, be they RED, be they nature-based solutions, require a land use change for the benefit of some corporation elsewhere being able to claim that its climate damage has been undone. That land use change is pushed on communities who've been safeguarding forests. And within a community, it often falls very disproportionately and unevenly on some more than on others, while those who have the least restrictions to face are often the ones who get the most of the meager benefits that arise. So RED, and we fear nature-based solutions on an even larger scale, will introduce little money, but a lot of strife and conflict in communities. And as I said, along with that, a lot of dishonesty by those who promote nature-based solutions about where the money comes from and who benefits from nature-based solutions. It's not forest peoples, it's not indigenous peoples, and it isn't going to be the climate. And that is why we called this conference today to share with you our perspective on the dangers of this deceitful idea of nature-based solutions. I thank you. I will close today's conference with words of condolence to our friends at GRAIN and Alianza Biodiversidad, two organizations who were amongst the 12 who joined, who initiated the statement and who are grieving the loss of their colleague, Carlos Vicente, who passed away yesterday. Rest in peace, Carlos, and our heartfelt condolences to colleagues at GRAIN and at Alianza Biodiversidad. With those words, I say thank you for joining us today. Please do get in touch if you want to, if you need contacts for any of the speakers. Thank you very much, and out and over. Bye.